welcome to Lawyer of the Week. Lawyer of the Week is creating a global community of lawyers, solicitors, and their support to inform and to encourage each other.
Hi, my name is Pamela Deneuve, and I help successful and focused lawyers to achieve peak performance and to create their legacy. Please join us for the interview with a peak performing lawyer this week. Hi, my name is Pamela Deneuve, and welcome to Lawyer of the Week. I am so pleased and honored to have Mark Cohen as our lawyer this week, and to give you a little preview of his success. Just this week, Mark's blog, The Legal Mosaic, was named by the ABA for their Web 100 as one of the top 50 legal blogs in the world, globally. So I really feel very honored to have Mark with us. And let me tell you a little bit more about him. Mark is a global thought leader in the legal industry, focused on legal delivery and education. He has had a distinguished 40-year career, the first part of which was devoted to legal practice. He earned an international reputation as a bet the company civil trial lawyer with stints as decorated assistant United States attorney, big law partner, national litigation boutique founder, and managing partner, federally appointed receiver of an international aviation parts business conducting operations on 4 continents, and outside general counsel to 3 insurance companies. During the past 20 years, Mark has focused on the business of law and developing and managing delivery models that improve legal service and education. He was co-founder and managing partner of ClearSpire, a revolutionary 2-company model law firm and legal services company that was the first to separate legal practice from legal delivery, the business of law. The ClearSpire model and its use of technology and project management set a new industry standard that remains today. Mark decided to join Elevate because of its alignment with ClearSpire's vision. In addition to serving as Elevate's chair of the advisory board and chief strategy officer, Mark is a distinguished fellow at Northwestern University Law School, a regular contributor to Forbes, this is where I first met or saw Mark. I didn't meet him, but I read his articles, where he has a column on the global legal marketplace, a sought-after keynote speaker and CEO of Legal Mosaic, and we'll have all of his links below, a legal business consultancy and repository for his work. He has won recognition as a legal innovator, writer, speaker, teacher, and trial lawyer. His Legal Mosaic blog was recently honored by the ABA as one of the 50 outstanding worldwide blogs, which I had mentioned earlier. Mark, welcome. We're so glad to have you here.
Thanks, Pamela. And boy, I love your enthusiasm.
Well, I just am so excited to have you here. And, you know, I've been reading your articles. You're really great, a lot better than I am on Twitter. And I see your following and read your article in Forbes. And I was just, before I talked with you, I was so excited to hear that you were recognized by the ABA for the work that you do on your blog, because you really have some very provocative topics.
Well, thank you very much. I was equally surprised, and I hope you don't mind my saying it publicly, that you disclosed to me not only that you have a granddaughter, which is hard to believe, but also that you have a granddaughter who's about to graduate from a little university in New Haven called Yale.
Yes.
So congratulations to you and for all the work that you do.
Thank you. Thank you so much. I appreciate that. So I'm going to go ahead and ask you, I want to just say this, that you too we should add on your biography, excellent husband, world traveler, speaker, and wonder father with
Aren't
two
you
wonderful
nice?
daughters.
Well, I'd say that my daughters would say probably my greatest strength is I'm a world-class schmoozer. That's the way they describe it.
Great. I love that. Okay, so I'm going to ask you the Lawyer of the Week questions. And
Sure.
the first one is, when and what made you decide to become a lawyer in the first place?
Well, Pamela, I think if I'm to be honest, I had two choices prenatally. Either I was going to be a doctor like three generations in my family, or a good lawyer. Not a lawyer, but a good lawyer. I don't know that I really managed to do either of them, but I did become a lawyer. And I think that from a very early age, as you can tell, I'm not a shy individual. I like people. I like the idea of speaking, communicating, and persuading. And as a result, I found myself from an early age thinking, I'd sort of like to be a trial lawyer. And that's the first 30 years of my career was being a trial lawyer.
Interesting. Now, are there any other lawyers in your family or just doctors?
Just doctors,
Ah,
no other lawyers. Although when people used to comment about, my trial ability, and they'd say, "Is there anyone that you're ever afraid to, enter into an argument with?" I say, "Only my wife and daughters," and that holds true today.
very good.
Haven't
Very
won
good.
too many cases at home.
I was just curious, what was your family's reaction when you decided to become a lawyer instead of a doctor?
Oh, they were fine with it. They were absolutely fine with it. In fact, my father offered me just one little piece of advice about integrity, and
Uh-huh.
that you can only compromise your professional integrity once.
Yes.
So don't do it.
Yes.
And that was good advice. I remember he told me that the day I was sworn in as a lawyer.
Wonderful. That's a great bit of advice, and maybe more people would heed that in and out of law,
I
truly.
would agree with that.
Now, tell me, how did you become a writer and a thought leader for the legal community?
Uh, well, I I've always enjoyed writing. It's something. It's just a way of one of the ways I express myself. And I guess it was a combination of wanting to put down into writing some of my professional experiences, some of my observations, and people encouraged me to do it. They said that I kind of had a story to tell,
Mm-hmm.
and I'm all about storytelling.
Mm-hmm.
And so, to be honest, Pamela, I did it more initially as a kind of a catharsis, as just a form of self-expression. I never really particularly thought that too many people would be interested, particularly writing about my legal career. I thought, well, certainly if I had written about maybe my personal life, that might have been a little more interesting. But lo and behold, I started to see that people started responding to it. They would write to me. They would tell me that it moved them, or and curiously enough, if you don't mind my just riffing a little bit longer on this,
No,
one of the
please.
things that I thought was very interesting to me is I've always tried to be a very authentic human being. And when I used to poll juries, that was one of the things that people would repeatedly tell me, is that we liked your authenticity.
Mm.
And I think I've sort of done that as well with my writing. I try not to denigrate people, but at the same time, I try not to pull punches, and I call it as I see it. And I don't in any way mean to suggest that I'm the Delphic Oracle or that I have all the answers. But I've been around for a while. I've seen our industry from many different perspectives, and I also try to inject a little bit of my personality and humanity into the writing. And I think that's something that people have told me that they respond to.
That's great. I mean, you are very authentic in what I've read, and you don't pull any punches. You're not smiling and glad handing the legal community. Now, just just going back in history a little bit. So when you began practicing law, um, it was a very rigid and kind of strict, firm culture, and this is the way it's done. And how does that background, and as you know, there's still a lot of that. How does that background affect your message today?
That's a great question. Well, I remember at the time being horribly disappointed by legal culture. I thought, as you had mentioned before, that it was very rigid. It was very pedigree centric, where you went to school, and frankly, how you looked and how you acted were more important often than what you could do to advance client interests. And I was kind of amazed, having grown up in New York City. I was kind of amazed at how frankly pale, stale, and male the legal environment was. Women, I think, I noticed very early on were systematically given short shrift. And I thought that there was more than a little bit of irony to the fact that, a profession that is charged with, acting in the best interest of society, preserving the rule of law, and all those, sort of lofty ideals itself would be structured this way. And it really bothered me. So to come back to, how that informs what I do today, I'm a little disappointed that in the 40 years since I've become a lawyer, that the good news is, I just read that Eversheds, for example, just appointed its first female global managing partner. That's great, but I find it distressing that we have to think that that's somehow newsworthy. Or, when an African American is promoted to partnership or a managing partner, that's somehow newsworthy. I'm waiting for the time when that's no longer newsworthy.
Wow, that's a really very thought-provoking. Now, given that, what would you say the message that you are, the overall message that you're trying to convey when you write and in your blog and in Forbes? Because I look at it, it's kind of like a wake up call. So what is the message that you're conveying out
Well,
there?
I think, Pamela, there are a couple of messages. First, let's not pretend that law is not a business. It is certainly a profession, and lawyers, first and foremost, are guided by ethics, by doing the right thing. And doing the right thing, in my mind, is simultaneously zealously, competently, ethically, and within the boundaries of law, representing two clients. The first, everybody knows, which is the client that engages or retains a lawyer. But equally importantly, and I think something that's often forgotten, particularly in big law, but also in retail law too, is that lawyers have a social compact with society as a whole. To represent it and to defend the rule of law. I'm very troubled by the fact that, as Derek Bach, a lawyer and the former president of Harvard University, once famously said, there's too much law for those that can afford it and too little for those that can't. And I am appalled that, about 80% of individuals in this country in need of legal representation can't afford it. About 2/3 of small businesses go unrepresented in matters which for them are bet the company. And there's just something really wrong with that. And I think that our profession needs to do something about that. And it's also, ironically, will also be good business. Lawyers just have to, I think, get out from under the notion that that legal services is only about lawyers. And, they've kind of got to get with the program a little bit.
Yes. Yes.
It's a
Okay.
changing world. And you look at how many other industries are efficiently and effectively, for example, using technology, using process to create greater access to goods and services, to provide consumers with more choice, affordable options, a range of options. And lawyers have to realize that sometimes good is good enough.
Yes. This just brings me to, this is another question out of the blue for you, but I'm enjoying this discussion. What, in your years being in the atmosphere, why do you think the law firms are so reticent to making change? Why do you think it's so difficult for that profession to
Well,
make these adjustments?
as my friend Richard Susskind famously wrote, it's hard to tell a room full of multimillionaires that your economic model is broken. If I had to reduce it to one word, really, it's greed. From partners' perspectives, until very recently, I think, they understandably believe that if it ain't broke, don't fix it. But I think that clients are now starting to drive the bus. Clients are now starting to recognize that law is no longer, the delivery of legal services is no longer exclusively the province of lawyers, that they can get legal services outside of law firms, that the practice of law and the delivery of legal services are two different but related things, that there's technology available that can help to make things more automated, that can better leverage differentiated legal skills. Pamela, it's a different ballgame. And this is nothing unique to law. You look at how the world has changed, in the years since the global financial crisis, just a decade ago. Back then, Amazon, was only, selling books online, and there was no Uber, there was no Airbnb, there was no iPhone. The world has changed a lot, and so too look at the retail industry and what's happening there. I'm not saying what's better and what's worse, but the train has definitely left the station. And I think that for several years, the legal industry was still on the platform. But now I think consumers are insisting that law, become more modernized.
Yes. So, and I wanted to add to your list of Airbnb and Uber, iTunes.
iTunes, there you go.
Revolutionized the music industry.
Yes, it did.
Revolutionized.
Yes, it did.
Yeah, I just want, as a side note, it's interesting. I had a call from someone from Asia earlier today who was talking about the legal, these online tech companies that have, they can click on a button and they have a legal problem, and if the lawyer is available or whoever's available, they can get their services done for some, nominal amount of money.
Right.
So that's the first time. I'm a little slow, so that's the first time I actually realized how widespread this is becoming, and what a blow this is to the traditional legal community.
Well, Pamela, I don't think that this is a zero-sum game. That is to say that I don't think that a group of technologists are necessarily going to co-opt the legal industry. But what I do think is going to happen is that for the tens of millions of Americans, and by the way, the same access to justice crisis is in evidence throughout Europe, in Australia, in Canada even, that lawyers are going to have to see, smart lawyers are going to see that, technology is not necessarily a foe, but it's going to be a vehicle by which they can, sort of re-engineer the way they deliver their services, and do it in a much, much more cost-effective way. And I think it's remarkably short-sighted of them to say, oh my gosh, but if, my billable hours, my rate goes from $300 to $100, I'm ruined. Well, but what if that, reduction in rate allows you to be wildly more efficient and represent 5 times as many clients as you do today? I really do believe that it could be a win-win.
Yes.
And that lawyers really should start thinking of it in those terms.
Yeah. Excellent. Excellent. I totally agree. I totally agree. Now, we try to encourage peak performance, or I do, as since I work with lawyers for peak performance. And I really would call you our model for peak performance. So can you describe for us the obstacles that you overcame to become successful as you have, and you've had various genres of and times and different lifetimes of careers of being successful, but one thing that is consistent is your success. So can you describe what you did to overcome to become successful?
Well, I'm going to tell you an example of one thing that I did, which was, kind of both a success and in some ways a failure. But, sort of the common threads are you have to know your craft. That's first and foremost. You have to be yourself. We're all individuals, and I think that one of the shames of legal culture is that it does not enshrine individuality so much as it tries to impose, certain homogeneous standards and norms. And I think that it's really, really important once you've learned your craft to be able to draw from your different passions, your background, who you are as a person. I think that's really important, particularly for lawyers, because I've always said that law is the persuasion business. You have to be able to persuade someone in the first instance that you're the right person, to be retained as a lawyer. You have to persuade the other side that you know what you're doing. You have to persuade the judge, so on and so forth. So those are, sort of some of the things. I think you also have to, hopefully you're going to be passionate about it. It's not just a job, but it's something that you really bring your A game and maximum energy to. Because if you're not going to do it, I think it's time to check out. I checked out as a trial lawyer because I was kind of losing the passion for it. I wanted to do other things. And I just realized that, hey, I shouldn't be doing this if I'm not all in. And so I walked away, to the surprise of a lot of people in my firm who knew me. And in terms of what I had promised, nobody is successful straight through. Everybody has disappointments. I spent 7 years of my life creating and designing and implementing and managing ClearSpire. We were in The Economist several times. The Wall Street Journal thought we were great. Everybody around the world was fascinated by what we were doing. They were very inspired. I think it was probably my greatest intellectual success in my career as a lawyer. But unfortunately, in 7 years, I didn't draw any money. I lost $2 million of my own money. And more than that, I was just supremely frustrated by the fact that something that I remain convinced, as do others, was really an inspired idea, and implementation was not the success that it could have been. And in fact, I was just persuaded to write the ClearSpire story, which has recently been published in a book in Germany, and I'm going to be coming out with it just next week, Pamela, so I hope you'll read it.
Oh, boy.
And it's a real no-holds-bar story, not only of, sort of what ClearSpire was and how it was, novel and ahead of its time,
Right.
but the very human story of what it really means to be an entrepreneur, what innovation really is about, and dare I say, about unfinished business. As a kid, I was a pretty serious competitive athlete. I was a trial lawyer. I don't compete against other people. I compete against myself. And it was just very, very frustrating. And I'm kind of happy to, sort of extend the sports metaphor that I'm going to be getting a second turn at bat with the ClearSpire model. So stay tuned.
Wonderful. What is it? It's going to be in a book. It's called The ClearSpire Story.
Yeah, well, actually, it is in a book written by a very famous German scholar called Marcus Hartung at Bucerius Law School in Germany. And Marcus and some professional colleagues have written a book on the impact of technology on legal services. And it's a chapter in the book. It's, I think, one of the 2 or 3 English chapters. Most of them are in German. I reserve the right to republish it as I saw fit.
Yes.
So it's going to be coming out in my Legal Mosaic blog next week, in fact.
Awesome. Oh, wonderful. Okay, that's great. So, one of the things that as you speak about ClearSpire and as walking away from your successful career or practice as a trial lawyer, is I hear that you've been willing to take risks.
Right.
And you've been willing to be curious and to think outside the box in order to create these different chapters in your career.
Right. I don't think that life, maybe when I was a kid, there was a little bit of a life plan put forward to me.
Yeah.
But I was, I just thought to myself, I like doing things a little bit differently. I'm sort of traditional with an edge.
Yes.
I have respect for tradition. I have respect for history, but I'm also very inquisitive. I like to, sort of architect things. So I guess when I first became a lawyer, I felt that this was a bit of a booby prize because, here I was given certain rules and how to operate in a certain environment, and that environment wasn't exactly the type of environment that I particularly liked. So, first chance I got, I started saying, okay, well, I'm not going to change an industry perhaps, but I've got to find another way to, sort of express myself. And I was fortunate enough to be able to do it. But, if you take risks, obviously, you only hear about the pioneers that made it to the promised land, not to about the ones particularly that perished on the journey.
Right.
So that's why, a lot of times when I hear innovation being bandied about, and law is probably the least innovative, most precedent kind of obsessed industry I can think of. I find it, it almost makes me giggle, to think of these innovation awards. I don't know how much real innovation there is in our industry. Certainly some clever people are borrowing from other industries. They are adapting technology, in certain ways and applying it to the law. But real innovation, I think, is, it's kind of, let's face it, I think Steve Jobs is an innovator, people like that, but
Yes.
there are not that many, and that's okay. I think it's just, let's just say that it's great when people are curious. It's great when people, sort of look at challenges or problems or what they perceive to be problems and say, can I do this differently?
Yeah.
I think that's great. And I think certainly our profession, our industry has some wicked problems that need to be addressed. And what
Okay.
excites me is I think that the legal field is getting a much needed reboot.
That's good to hear. So what would you say, I appreciate your story about ClearSpire. What would you just say to some lawyers out there who might be feeling a little discouraged or feeling like they're kind of lost, and they're a lawyer, they don't know, they're stuck, or they've lost their enthusiasm for practicing law? What would you say to those people?
Well, I would say, number one, particularly to the younger ones who are laboring under a lot of education debt, I feel for you, because I think it's just, that's one of the wicked problems, frankly, Pamela, that I think has to be solved. And there are tools to solve it. But back to your very good question. I think the first thing I would say is, if you are not passionate about what you are doing, if you are bored, then I think you really should start thinking in terms of, okay, let me start reading up on what's going on in the marketplace. Let me understand it a little bit better, because I think that knowledge is power. And as Joe Walsh once wrote before he sold himself out and went to the Eagles, he said early in his career, he did a song called Garden Gate, where he says, the captain's in the chart room navigating by the stars. We don't know where we're going because we don't know where we are. So if you don't know where you are, it's going to be very hard to plot your next move, or it's not going to be very productive. So I would say the first thing I would tell as lawyers are, invest a little time and energy to sort of try to figure out what's going on in the marketplace. And then I would say, look beyond the normal and, sort of immediate knee-jerk reaction. I don't like this firm, I'm going to go to another firm, or I'll look for an in-house job. I mean, I think that there are a lot of new possibilities out there. But people have to be aware of what they are, where they are, and equally importantly, or maybe most importantly, what skills are going to be required to be able to function and take advantage of those opportunities. Because, another thing my dad used to say is, in all periods of a significant change, a lot of people get lost, but there are always going to be people who will actually, thrive in those circumstances and create new opportunities for other people.
That's very good. Now, with all of this in your entire career and Legal Mosaic and ClearSpire, what is the legacy? And being a great dad and a speaker, what is the legacy that you want to leave for the legal community?
Wow. Well, legacy is a big word. I don't know that I'm necessarily going to have a legacy, but if you were to ask me, maybe if I may, put it a slightly different way and say, so how would you like people to remember you? From first and foremost, I would like people to say he's a good guy, even if I didn't agree with him. I think he was honorable, and he called it as he saw it. And as he got older, he actually became much more tolerant of other points of view, and wasn't just so quick to say, okay, no, that's not it. I guess also I'd like in some small way, Pamela, I'm not going to cure cancer,
Yeah.
but I find it immensely gratifying. When I made a lot of money, as a practicing lawyer, I loved the craft. I loved trying cases, but I was never passionate about the profession. Now, years later, I make a fraction of what I used to make, but I have a lot more satisfaction. And curiously, I actually care a lot about the profession,
That's wonderful.
which has kind of surprised me.
Mhm.
And so I guess I would like to, in some small ways, continue to contribute either one-on-one or with groups where people will, write to me from around the world and say, hey, I read this, a light went on, or, I was moved by that. That's very meaningful. And so I would say it's kind of propelling me to do more of it
Mhm.
because I like it. And
Yeah.
it makes me feel good to make other people feel as if they're in some incremental way getting something out of what I'm doing.
That's really great. The word that just rang out to me is meaningful. That, you know, that makes your heart happy to be meaningful, to provide something meaningful that means something to others and to in the
Yes.
world.
And sometimes, by the way, it doesn't have to be any profound or, analytical kind of thing. It can be something as simple as making someone on the street smile.
Oh,
Um, as I get older, I find that what's really meaningful to me is not particularly awards. I mean, everybody likes to get a trophy for sure.
yeah.
But it's just, when strangers or people I don't know well
Hmm.
will just say, you made my day.
Yeah.
That's meaningful. And you hope that, over a period of time, in your professional life, you do little things that, people later say is meaningful.
Yes.
That's kind of how I keep score these days.
That's wonderful. I have a couple of dogs and I live near the ocean, not on the ocean, by the way, but I live near the ocean where I can go to the beach in the morning and walk my dogs. And I'll do this quirky thing sometimes, and that I'll just smile. And I just walk down the beach and I smile. And then if I have to stop at the store, I smile. And it's so amazing how people light up, if you just smile, because
Well,
so many people aren't smiling.
or also, just make eye contact with people.
Yes, yes,
I find that when I'm, in large cities anywhere in the world, I'll walk down the street, I'll make eye contact with people, all
yes,
different kinds of people. Sometimes I
yes.
will smile. It's just amazing
Mhm.
what a difference that makes. And by the way, I think that, relating this to lawyers, and I know, you deal with a lot of lawyers,
Yes.
um, I used to say to people who worked in my firms, hey, don't check your humanity at the door when you come to work every day.
Yeah.
And I think that's part of it. I mean, I think it's really important for lawyers, particularly because, as a profession, we have a terrible track record of alcoholism, drug abuse, divorce, suicide, depression, you name it.
Yeah.
Um, all the not so good stuff.
Yeah.
I'm not saying that a smile or a little levity is going to prevent someone from that. But it certainly isn't going to drive them that way any faster.
Right. That's great. So, our final Lawyer of the Week question, which we ask everyone, is name one thing you do to relieve your stress levels.
Well, I'll give you two. One is every day I try to take a long walk.
Mm.
I don't carry my iPhone. I don't have even music plugged in. I just try to look at, trees and in the warm weather, flowers and things, and just kind of reacclimate myself to the world.
Yes.
I find that that's very soothing. And then another thing that I do from time to time is my wife calls it my rock and roll dungeon. I like to, blow off a little steam. I was a disc jockey for many, many years.
Oh, wow.
And I like to go on YouTube and, sort of play different music really loud.
Oh, wow. I love that. And I'm just going to have to add, with that beautiful piece of art in the back, you certainly have some passion for art to have that piece of art.
Well, I'm a very visual guy, and if I hadn't had to be a doctor or a lawyer, probably I would do what one of my daughters does, and be a writer and a Hollywood script writer. I'm a very visual guy, and I find art is wonderful, and it's actually very soothing. I have a lot of art all through our house, and sometimes I'll do that too, just to let off some steam.
Wonderful. Well, this has been just such a great interview. I've enjoyed speaking with you and hearing, the person behind the articles. I'm a little like starstruck, I guess.
Oh, please tell that to my wife, please.
But thank you so much for being our Lawyer of the Week. And to our audience, we hope to see you again next week. Thank you for joining Lawyer of the Week. As always, I encourage and support each one of you to achieve your own peak performance, move your law practice to the next level, and create your own legacy. I love to read your comments about how you achieve peak performance in your law practice below.